I am Richard Caldwell, 66 years old and a retired civil engineer. I recently discovered my only daughter erased my last name from her life, completely replacing it with her wealthy stepfather's name. I did not scream or demand an explanation from her. I simply stopped paying for her entire existence. 3 months later, she sent me a demanding text message asking for her college tuition. I told her to ask the man whose name she so proudly took. 1 week after that, she and her mother sued me for everything I had left. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty is a choice and respect must be earned, never bought. It was a standard Tuesday afternoon when the final shred of my illusion shattered. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light across my driveway as I walked out to the mailbox. Among the usual collection of utility bills and grocery store circulars, a thick cream-colored envelope stood out. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind that required extra postage. It was addressed to my home, but the recipient name printed on the front made me freeze. It said, "To the parents of Sarah Winston." I stared at the elegant ink for a long time. My daughter was born Sarah Caldwell. For 21 years, she was a Caldwell. The envelope had not been sent by her. It was an automated mailing from her prestigious university, evidently pulling from their updated registrar database but accidentally using her permanent home address on file instead of her campus apartment. I slid my thumb under the wax seal and pulled out the invitation. The bold gold lettering gleamed against the heavy cardstock. It read, "The Dean of Students cordially invites you to a banquet, celebrating the academic achievements of Sarah Winston." The physical pain in my chest was immediate and sharp. It was not a dull ache. It felt exactly like a physical blow beneath my ribs. I did not lose my daughter in a massive argument. I did not lose her to a tragic accident. I was completely erased with a bureaucratic pen stroke. She had gone to the courthouse, filed the paperwork, stood before a judge, and legally stripped my identity from her life. She did this while still living in the apartment. I paid for driving the car I bought and attending the university I financed. She had adopted the last name of Bradley Winston, the man her mother had left me for. She wanted the world to see her as his daughter, his legacy, his blood. The sheer calculation required to execute a legal name change without ever mentioning a single word of it to me was staggering. It meant every phone call we shared over the past year, every time she cheerfully asked me to transfer extra spending money, she was already secretly a Winston. I stood alone at the end of my driveway, the cold wind rustling the dry oak leaves around my feet, holding the undeniable proof of my own obsolescence. I walked slowly back into my quiet, empty house. I closed the front door and leaned against the solid wood, letting the profound silence of the hallway wash over me. I walked into the living room and looked at the framed photographs lining the mantelpiece. There was Sarah in her private high school uniform. I had worked mandatory overtime for 6 consecutive years to afford those tuition payments. I remembered the endless nights reviewing engineering blueprints until my eyes blurred, ensuring she would never have to take out a student loan. I remembered buying her that silver sedan for her 18th birthday, watching her drive away with her friends, feeling an immense pride that I could provide a safe, reliable vehicle for my only child. Patricia, my ex-wife, had always mocked my cautious financial planning. 10 years ago, she packed her bags and walked out the door claiming I was too boring, too predictable, too focused on the future instead of enjoying the present. She walked straight into the waiting arms of Bradley Winston. Bradley was a commercial real estate developer who drove loud European sports cars and lived in a sprawling glass mansion overlooking the city. He was everything Patricia craved. He was flashy, loud, and supposedly swimming in endless cash. From the moment Bradley entered their lives, I was actively downgraded. I was no longer a father. I was an automated teller machine wrapped in a dusty sweater. Bradley bought them expensive vacations to tropical resorts, while I quietly funded the mundane necessities of life. I paid the medical bills, I paid the car insurance. I paid the cellular phone plan. I was the silent foundation that allowed them to float through their glamorous, superficial existence. They viewed me as a limitless resource, a pathetic older man so desperate for a scrap of affection from his daughter that he would gladly write check after check. And looking at the gold lettering on the university invitation, I realized they were absolutely right. I had allowed myself to become a doormat in the name of unconditional love. But unconditional love should never be a suicide pact for your own dignity. I did not reach for my telephone to call Sarah. I did not text Patricia to demand an explanation. I did not throw the invitation across the room or smash a glass against the wall. The time for emotional outbursts had passed 10 years ago. A profound, icy calm settled over my mind. The betrayal was so absolute, so undeniably complete, that it instantly severed the emotional strings manipulating me. If she was truly Sarah Winston, then Richard Caldwell had no financial obligations to her. I walked into my home office and sat down in my leather desk chair. I woke up my computer and opened the web browser. I navigated to my primary investment bank portal and typed in my complex security password. The screen loaded, displaying my various accounts. At the very top of the list was the revocable educational trust fund I had established when Sarah was 12 years old. The current balance sat at exactly $120,000. This was the money intended to cover her final year of undergraduate studies and her master degree program. Because I was the sole creator and grantor of the revocable trust, I retained total legal control over the assets. I clicked on the Account Management tab. I selected the option titled Revoke and Transfer. A warning screen appeared asking me to confirm that I intended to dissolve the trust entirely. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I clicked Confirm. I selected my private secure retirement checking account as the destination. I typed in my digital authorization signature. The screen displayed a loading icon for 3 seconds before a green checkmark appeared. The transaction was complete. The trust was empty. The financial umbilical cord was permanently severed. I closed the web browser. I shut the laptop. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I felt lighter. I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer a victim being slowly drained of my life savings. I was a man who had finally drawn a boundary written in concrete. 3 entire months passed in total uninterrupted silence. That 90-day period was the ultimate confirmation of everything I had realized. Sarah did not call me to ask how my week was going. She did not text me to share a funny story from her classes. She did not reach out for Father Day. She only ever contacted me when she needed a financial injection. And since her auto draft accounts were fully funded for the previous semester, she had absolutely no use for Richard Caldwell. The silence did not hurt me anymore. It simply proved my hypothesis. The seasons changed, the weather grew colder, and my life continued peacefully. Then, on a Thursday evening, while I was cooking a quiet dinner, my cellular phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a message from Sarah. I dried my hands on a towel and picked up the device. The text message did not contain a greeting. It did not say hello. It read exactly as follows. Dad, my college tuition is due tomorrow morning. The university portal says the auto draft payment failed. Fix it right now, or they are going to drop my classes. The sheer arrogance of the demand was breathtaking. She did not ask if there was a problem with the bank. She issued a direct order to a man whose last name she had legally discarded in a courtroom. I looked at the glowing screen for a long moment. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I opened the keyboard and typed out my response. I did not use capital letters to yell. I did not use exclamation points to convey anger. I simply stated a biological and legal fact. I wrote, "Ask your stepfather. You made your choice." I pressed send. I watched the message deliver. I then tapped on her contact profile. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen and pressed the button labeled Block This Caller. I confirmed the action. I placed the phone back down on the granite counter and returned to stirring my dinner. The bridge was not just burned. I had detonated the explosive charges and watched the concrete pillars fall into the river below. Exactly 1 week later, the consequences of my silence arrived at my front porch. It was a crisp Wednesday morning. I was in my garage organizing my heavy tool chest when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked through the house to the front entryway. I opened the solid oak door. A tall man in a cheap gray suit stood on my welcome mat. He held a thick clipboard and a heavy manila envelope. He looked at me with a completely bored expression and asked if I was Richard Caldwell. I confirmed my identity. He thrust the heavy envelope into my hands, stated that I was officially served, and immediately turned around to walk back to his idling sedan. I closed the door and looked down at the package. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a silver letter opener, and sliced through the thick paper tape. I slid the contents onto the kitchen island. It was a massive legal binder filled with dozens of pages of densely packed legal jargon. I flipped to the primary complaint form. The plaintiffs were listed as Patricia Lawson and Sarah Winston. They were suing me in civil court. I scanned down to the monetary damages section. They were demanding $150,000. The official charge listed on the document was breach of contract and intentional infliction of financial distress. I stared at the crisp black ink. My ex-wife and my daughter, the daughter who had actively erased my name from her birth certificate, had the unmitigated audacity to drag me into a court of law to forcibly extract my life savings. They believed they could legally compel me to fund a life I was no longer permitted to be a part of. The sheer entitlement was staggering. A cold smile spread across my face. They thought they were intimidating an old, tired man into writing a settlement check to make the problem go away. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear down their entire fraudulent empire. The silent adjustment was over. The active demolition was about to begin. I drove downtown the very next morning and parked my truck beneath a towering glass and steel skyscraper. I did not call a friendly neighborhood family lawyer who specialized in mediation and feelings. I called Michael Gallagher. Michael was a ruthless corporate litigator, a man who dismantled fraudulent companies and broke aggressive hostile takeovers for a living. I had met him 7 years ago during a highly contested zoning dispute for a municipal bridge engineering project, and I intimately knew his brutal reputation in the courtroom. He was cold, intensely analytical, and completely devoid of empathy for anyone sitting on the opposing side of his massive mahogany desk. I walked into his corner office, bypassed the customary small talk, and handed him the thick legal binder I had received from the process server. He did not offer me a cup of coffee or ask how my retirement was going. He simply gestured to a high-backed leather chair, put on his reading glasses, and began to read the complaint. The silence in the spacious room stretched for nearly 30 unbroken minutes. The only sound was the crisp, methodical turning of heavy paper and the faint, distant hum of city traffic 30 floors below our windows. I sat perfectly still and watched his eyes scan the dense paragraphs, waiting for him to locate the legal trap my ex-wife and my daughter had supposedly set for me. Finally, he closed the heavy binder and took off his silver-rimmed glasses. He looked at me with a completely flat, unreadable expression. He asked me if I specifically remembered signing a post-marital financial addendum on the 7th of October, exactly 5 years ago. I stared at him in genuine, profound confusion. I firmly told him our divorce had been completely finalized 10 years ago, and I had never signed a single additional legal document regarding Patricia or Sarah since the judge struck the gavel. Gallagher did not argue with my statement. He simply opened the binder again and turned it to face me. He pushed a specific highlighted page across the polished wood of his desk. I leaned forward and looked down at the document. It was formally titled Addendum to Marital Settlement Agreement regarding continuing parental obligations. The legal phrasing was incredibly dense, expertly crafted to sound official, but the core demand buried within the text was sickeningly clear. The document boldly claimed that I, Richard Caldwell, had legally and voluntarily bound myself to cover 100% of all living medical housing and educational expenses for Sarah Winston until she reached her 25th birthday. It explicitly stated that this massive financial obligation remained absolute and unconditional regardless of my personal relationship with her, regardless of her academic performance, and completely regardless of her legal last name. The document essentially framed me as a permanent, legally bound financial slave, permanently stripped of any parental rights, denied any emotional connection, but tightly chained to every single financial burden she might ever incur. According to the specific terms laid out on this piece of paper, my daughter and her mother were not merely suing me for a single semester of tuition money. They were actively attempting to establish an ironclad legal precedent that would allow them to systematically drain my hard-earned retirement accounts for the next 4 years without ever having to speak a single word to me. Gallagher leaned back in his expensive leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He plainly stated that the entire lawsuit was constructed around the absolute validity of this single addendum. He warned me that if the court deemed the document real and legally binding, the judge would enforce it without hesitation. I would be ordered to immediately liquidate my carefully managed assets to pay the $150,000 demand, and I would be responsible for paying their exorbitant legal fees as well. I did not panic or raise my voice. I leaned closer to the desk and looked at the bottom of the page. My heart pounded a slow, heavy, and deliberate rhythm against my ribs. I pointed to the dark blue ink at the very end of the final paragraph. I told Michael to look very closely at the signature. I stared at the dark blue ink curving across the white paper. To an untrained eye or a bored courtroom clerk skimming through files, it looked exactly like my handwriting. The loops were tight, and the letters leaned slightly to the right, just as they always did when I signed checks. But I had spent 40 years drafting complex structural schematics where a single millimeter of error meant a massive building could collapse. I knew my own physical habits perfectly. I knew the precise angle and pressure of every stroke. I pointed my index finger directly at the capital letter at the beginning of my first name. I explained to Michael that I always lift my pen completely off the paper before starting the downward stroke of the first curve. It was an old drafting habit. The signature printed on this legal document did not have that microscopic break in the ink line. The person who forged this had drawn the entire letter in one continuous motion. They had practiced tracing my name, but they did not know the invisible mechanics behind how I wrote it. Gallagher leaned in closer and held the paper up to the natural light streaming through his window. He studied the ink before carefully lowering the document back to his desk. He did not seem surprised. He had spent his entire career swimming with corporate sharks. He stated that proving a forgery in a civil court often required an expensive handwriting expert, and even then judges could be unpredictable. He told me we needed something far more undeniable than a missing pen stroke to completely destroy this lawsuit. He slid his reading glasses back down his nose and focused his attentions on the bottom right corner of the page. He pointed at the circular black ink stamp pressed over the typed date. It was a formal notary public seal. The legal system heavily relied on the absolute integrity of these official stamps. For a financial addendum like this to hold absolute power in a courtroom, a licensed state notary had to swear under penalty of perjury that they personally verified my identity and physically watched me sign the paper. Gallagher read the tiny print inside the circular stamp aloud. The name of the licensed notary was Kelly Higgins. He turned his heavy leather chair toward his computer monitors and began typing rapidly. The sharp clacking of his keyboard filled the quiet room. He had direct access to comprehensive legal directories and corporate employment databases. I watched the bright reflection of the scrolling screens flicking across his face. Less than 2 minutes later, the rapid typing abruptly stopped. A slow and dangerous smile crept across his face. He turned back to me and crossed his arms over his chest. He informed me that he had located Kelly Higgins in the state registry. She was not an independent clerk working at a local bank branch. She was currently employed as a senior administrative assistant. I asked him exactly who she worked for. Gallagher leaned forward and delivered the killing blow. She worked at Winston Commercial Real Estate. She was directly employed by Bradley Winston. The scattered puzzle pieces violently snapped together into a perfectly clear picture. This was not simply a case of my greedy daughter and my bitter former wife trying to squeeze a few extra dollars out of my retirement fund. This was a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. Bradley Winston, the supposedly wealthy real estate mogul who had stolen my family and mocked my modest lifestyle, had actively directed his own employee to commit a severe felony. He had used his own private office resources to forge a legally binding contract to steal my savings. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. They were so confident in my absolute submission and so utterly convinced that I was a weak man who would never fight back that they had not even bothered to cover their tracks properly. They assumed my silence over the past few months was a sign of absolute surrender. They truly believed I would be so terrified by the threat of court that I would hand over the money without ever investigating the paperwork. They had severely underestimated me. Gallagher immediately grabbed his desk telephone. He looked at me with the predatory intensity of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He stated that we possessed absolute proof of a coordinated felony. He wanted to call his personal contacts at the district attorney office right that very second. He explained that falsifying a legally binding financial contract and fraudulently using a registered notary seal were severe criminal offenses. He painted a vivid picture of state detectives walking into the Winston Commercial Real Estate building by tomorrow afternoon. He imagined police cruisers parked in front of the flashy glass mansion, completely destroying the pristine public reputation of the man who stole my family. Gallagher promised me that we could have the wealthy stepfather arrested and formally charged before the weekend even began. I listened to his aggressive pitch. A brief and warm wave of satisfaction washed over me at the thought of Bradley being publicly humiliated in handcuffs. But my mind did not operate on brief flashes of emotion. I had spent 40 years building bridges and massive municipal structures. I knew that you never demolish a rotten building by simply hitting the front door with a hammer. You have to locate the foundational load bearing pillars and pack them with explosives. I held up my right hand and firmly told my lawyer to put the telephone down. I explained that calling the police right now would be a catastrophic tactical error. Bradley Winston was a man who spent his entire adult life swimming in corporate litigation. A sudden criminal investigation would not destroy him. It would only serve as a blaring alarm bell. I looked directly into the eyes of my lawyer and broke down the reality of the situation. If the police showed up at his office, Bradley would immediately hire a team of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in the city. He would expertly play the victim. He would completely deny any knowledge of the forged document and eagerly throw his administrative assistant directly to the wolves. He would claim she acted entirely on her own out of some misguided sense of loyalty to her boss. The assistant would go to prison, and the architect of my misery would walk away completely untouched. Furthermore, alerting him to our discovery would give him ample time to hide his money and protect his wealth. I told Gallagher that I did not want to merely win this single fabricated lawsuit. I wanted to completely eradicate the financial root of their arrogance. Their entire sense of superiority was built upon the illusion of endless wealth. That money was the only reason my former wife left me, and it was the absolute only reason my daughter erased my name from her life. Sending a low-level secretary to jail would accomplish absolutely nothing. I wanted to tear down the very fortress they used to look down on me. I wanted to use their own arrogance as the weapon that destroyed them. Gallagher slowly lowered the telephone receiver back onto the cradle. The aggressive and fast-talking lawyer suddenly went completely quiet. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from professional intensity to genuine respect. He asked me how exactly I planned to break a wealthy real estate developer without involving the criminal justice system. I told him we were going to use their own lawsuit as a trap. I instructed Gallagher to completely ignore the forgery for now. We would play along and pretend we believed the contract might be real. We would file a standard defense against their breach of contract claim, which would automatically push the lawsuit directly into the formal civil discovery phase. I knew that during civil discovery, my attorney would possess the absolute legal authority to demand comprehensive financial transparency. I wanted Gallagher to draft the most invasive financial audit legally permitted by the state. We would demand total access to every single bank account, every tax return, every corporate ledger, and every hidden asset belonging to the plaintiffs. We were going to legally force them to open their financial vaults. Gallagher smiled, a very cold and dark smile. He picked up his expensive silver pen, pulled a fresh legal pad across his desk, and told me he was going to make them bleed paper. I sat in the quiet office and watched Michael Gallagher transform from a consulting attorney into a predatory machine. He did not waste a single second. He immediately summoned 2 junior paralegals into the room and began dictating the framework of our legal response. He formally drafted a standard, completely unremarkable denial of the breach of contract claim. But the denial was merely the thin wooden door hiding the massive steel trap we were building right behind it. Embedded within our official response was a comprehensive demand for formal civil discovery. In the legal world, discovery is the phase where both sides are forced by the authority of the judge to show their hidden hands. If my former wife and her wealthy husband wanted to use the legal system to evaluate my financial capacity to pay their extortion demand, then the court inherently required a complete and total evaluation of their financial reality as well. Gallagher was not simply asking for a recent bank statement. He was drafting a forensic financial strip search. The list of demands grew longer and more invasive with every sentence he dictated. We demanded complete unredacted tax returns for both Patricia and Bradley for the past 7 consecutive years. We demanded the secure login records and complete transaction histories for every single domestic and international bank account bearing their names. Gallagher specifically included aggressive demands for the corporate ledgers of Bradley and his commercial real estate firm. We requested the titles, lease agreements, and payment histories for every luxury vehicle they drove. We demanded the mortgage documents, the property tax records, and the internal accounting books for their sprawling glass mansion. We demanded full disclosure of any outstanding corporate loans, private equity debts, and balloon payments tied to his commercial properties. We even included a legally binding request for every single credit card statement from the past 48 months to track their personal spending habits. Every single dollar that flowed into or out of their glamorous life was to be placed under a glaring legal microscope. If they spent money on expensive tropical vacations while claiming they desperately needed my retirement funds for basic college tuition, the court would see the blatant hypocrisy in black and white ink. I listened to the relentless list of demands and felt a deep sense of structural satisfaction. As a civil engineer, I spent my life looking for stress fractures in massive concrete pillars. I knew that the flashy, arrogant lifestyle Bradley flaunted was nothing more than a cosmetic facade built over a crumbling foundation. Wealthy men who truly possess stable fortunes do not direct their administrative assistants to forge illegal contracts to steal money from a retired engineer. They do not desperately need an unexpected $150,000. I knew in my bones that Bradley was drowning in invisible debt. His expensive suits and European sports cars were merely the paint hiding the rust. This discovery request was the equivalent of taking a massive sledgehammer to his fragile drywall. By legally forcing him to produce these documents, we were giving him a terrifying choice. He either had to turn over the paperwork and expose his financial ruin to the court, or he had to refuse the judge and face immediate legal sanctions and the total collapse of his own lawsuit. Within 2 hours, the massive document was perfectly formatted, printed and bound in heavy blue legal folders. The sheer physical weight of the paper felt like a weapon. Gallagher personally signed the final page with a thick black pen, his signature sealing their fate. He handed the document to a trusted legal courier with explicit instructions to file it directly with the county court clerk before the building closed. He also ordered the courier to serve a certified tracked copy immediately to the opposing counsel representing Patricia and my daughter. I thanked Michael for his precision and walked out of the towering glass building. I stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight and took a deep breath of the city air. I climbed into the cab of my reliable truck, the same truck they always mocked for being old and unrefined, and started the engine. For the first time since receiving that gold-lettered university invitation, I felt completely in control of my own destiny. I had not sent an angry text message to my daughter. I had not made a threatening phone call to my former wife. I had simply used the cold mechanical leverage of the legal system to drop a massive, unavoidable anvil directly over their heads. The trap was perfectly engineered and fully armed. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait for the rope to snap. 48 hours. That was exactly how long it took for the massive steel trap to snap shut on the leg of Bradley Winston. I was sitting at my kitchen island on Friday morning, drinking a cup of black coffee and reading the local newspaper. My cellular phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed an unlisted number. I usually ignore unknown callers, but a deep mechanical instinct told me exactly who was waiting on the other end of the line. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I did not say a word. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the rapid, shallow breathing on the other side. The voice that finally broke the silence was tight-strained and completely stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. It was Bradley. He did not bother with the customary condescension he usually reserved for me. He immediately launched into a frantic, fast-paced monologue. He sounded exactly like a man who had just looked over the edge of a deep cliff and realized the ground was rapidly crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes. He started his pathetic speech by shifting the blame entirely onto my former wife. He claimed Patricia had severely overreacted by filing the lawsuit and that the entire legal situation had simply gotten completely out of hand. He told me that family members should never involve ruthless lawyers and drag their private business through the public court system. The absolute hypocrisy of his statement was almost comical, considering he was the exact person who authorized the forged contract inside his own commercial real estate office. He then abruptly shifted his tone from defensive to conspiratorial. He lowered his voice into the receiver, acting as if he were letting me in on a highly exclusive corporate secret. He told me he wanted to act like a gentleman and make the entire problem go away right now. He offered to personally write me a certified cashier check for $100,000 by the end of the business day. The only condition was that I had to immediately instruct my attorney to drop the financial discovery demands and sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement. He aggressively promised that if I took the cash, Sarah would formally withdraw the lawsuit, and I would never have to hear from them again. He framed the proposal as a massive, lucky victory for me. He actually tried to sound generous. I remained completely silent on my end of the line, letting his desperate words hang in the air. My mind rapidly processed the undeniable reality hidden beneath his frantic offer. The mathematics of his proposal made absolutely zero logical sense. If Bradley was truly the invincible wealthy mogul he pretended to be, and if he genuinely believed his forged contract was legally watertight, he would simply let his expensive lawyers crush me in court to collect the full $150,000. Wealthy men do not frantically offer to pay their victims a massive sum of money just to stop a routine financial audit. They only do that when the audit is guaranteed to expose a lethal, catastrophic secret. His sudden willingness to part with $100,000 proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his corporate empire was completely hollow. Whatever toxic financial disaster he was hiding inside those private corporate ledgers was infinitely worse than the money he was offering me. He was utterly terrified of the light. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I spoke directly into the receiver with a calm, flat, and measured voice. I told Bradley that my retirement accounts were already perfectly funded, and I had absolutely no need for his dirty money. I told him I eagerly looked forward to reading his complete corporate tax returns in court next month. I ended the call without waiting for his response, and permanently blocked his number. I hung up the telephone and deliberately left my device resting on the cool kitchen counter. I knew my legal demand for absolute financial transparency would soon yield a massive mountain of complex documents. I also knew I desperately needed a highly specialized mind to read them. I was a civil engineer. I understood the predictable physics of steel and concrete. I did not understand the chaotic shell games played by desperate corporate executives. I needed someone who could look at a spreadsheet and instantly spot the hidden fractures. I called a man named William Hughes. William was a retired forensic accountant who used to work for the federal government. I knew him from my days managing city development contracts. He was a quiet and meticulous man who hunted tax evaders for sport. I drove directly to his modest brick house on the edge of town and explained the situation. I told him about the forged contract, the lawsuit, and the frantic phone call I had just received. William did not smile or express any outrage. He simply asked me to bring him the legal discovery files the very moment my lawyer secured them. He promised me he would personally map out every single dollar moving through the Winston household. 3 weeks later, the court formally ordered Bradley to comply with our discovery demands. A digital hard drive arrived at my house containing thousands of pages of corporate ledgers, tax returns, and bank statements. I took the drive straight to William. We sat in his basement office for 3 consecutive days. The room was filled with the soft hum of computer servers and the familiar smell of old paper. I watched as William aggressively tore into the financial architecture of Winston commercial real estate. He projected the complicated banking networks onto a large white screen on his wall. To me, it looked like a tangled web of meaningless numbers. But William read the dense spreadsheets the way I read structural blueprints. He methodically tracked the money flowing between personal accounts and corporate holdings. He highlighted massive and completely unexplained money transfers. He found shell companies that existed only on paper to hide mounting debts. It was a masterclass in organized financial deception. I sat back in my chair and watched the supposed wealth of my greatest enemy get systematically dismantled line by line. As we dug deeper into their personal spending records, a very specific and bitter memory washed over me. For the past 10 years, Bradley had weaponized his apparent wealth against me. He never missed a single opportunity to make me feel small. When I picked Sarah up for weekend visits in my reliable work truck, Bradley would casually pull into the driveway in a brand new imported sports car. He would wear heavy gold watches and custom-tailored suits just to stand on his porch and watch me drive away. He bought my daughter expensive designer handbags that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He took Patricia on luxury cruises to the Mediterranean and posted hundreds of pictures online for everyone to see. He did all of this to paint a very specific picture. He wanted to prove that he was the superior provider. He wanted my daughter to look at my modest home, my calloused hands, and my carefully managed budget and feel deeply ashamed of me. And for a very long time, his cruel strategy worked perfectly. Sarah began to roll her eyes at my sensible financial advice. She began to worship the flashy lifestyle Bradley provided. She bought into the illusion completely. But sitting in that dark basement staring at the projected spreadsheets, the entire 10-year illusion violently evaporated. William pointed to the long rows of data detailing their personal expenses. He showed me the vehicle registration documents. Bradley did not own a single one of those exotic sports cars. They were all leased under highly predatory terms. He pointed to the credit card statements. The luxury Mediterranean cruises and the designer handbags were not paid for with actual cash. They were entirely financed through high-interest revolving credit accounts. The massive glass mansion was mortgaged to the absolute maximum limit. There was virtually zero equity in anything he touched. Bradley was not a wealthy man. He was a master illusionist drowning in a bottomless ocean of high-interest debt. He used the bank money to purchase the loyalty of my former wife and the conditional love of my daughter. He built a towering castle out of plastic credit cards, and he used it to look down on a man who actually owned the solid ground he stood on. William turned away from the bright screen and looked directly at me. He stated that the personal debt was staggering, but he had found something much worse buried inside the corporate ledgers. The foundation was not just cracking, it was about to completely collapse. William turned away from the bright screen displaying the personal credit card debt and opened a new folder on his computer. He told me that the personal financial ruin was just a symptom of the disease. The actual terminal cancer was hidden inside the corporate ledgers of Winston Commercial Real Estate. He clicked a button, and a massive complex spreadsheet filled the projection wall. It was the master accounting file for Bradley and his real estate limited liability company. William walked up to the wall and pointed at a specific column of numbers. He explained that Bradley did not actually build anything. He was essentially a high-risk gambler playing with bank money. He purchased aging commercial properties using aggressively leveraged short-term loans, did some minor cosmetic renovations, and tried to flip them or rent them out before the massive loan notes came due. It was a strategy that only worked in a booming economy where credit was cheap and infinite. But the economy had shifted, the credit had dried up, and Bradley was caught completely exposed. William highlighted a specific property address on the spreadsheet. I instantly recognized the street name. It was a prominent commercial building downtown, a sleek office complex that Bradley always referred to as his flagship achievement. He used to host extravagant holiday parties in the penthouse suite, just to show off his supposed dominance in the local market. William tapped his finger against the projected numbers and dismantled the illusion. Bradley did not own that building. A private equity firm owned the paper on that building. Bradley had financed the entire purchase through a highly predatory commercial loan structure. And according to the contract William found buried in the digital files, the loan had a massive non-negotiable balloon payment attached to it. I asked William what a balloon payment actually meant in this context. He turned to me and explained the brutal reality of commercial lending. Bradley had been paying only the bare minimum interest on the massive loan for the past 5 years. He was essentially just renting the money. But the 5-year term was expiring. The private equity firm was now legally demanding a massive lump sum payment to keep the loan out of default. William highlighted the exact due date on the screen. The payment was due in exactly 28 days. I looked at the amount required. The number was $95,000. If Bradley failed to wire that exact amount of money to the private equity firm before 5 p.m. on that specific Friday, the lender would immediately seize the flagship property trigger, a cascading default on his other loans, and completely bankrupt his entire corporate empire. I sat forward in my chair and asked the most important question. I asked William exactly how much actual liquid cash Bradley had sitting in his corporate and personal bank accounts to cover that impending payment. William did not say a word. He simply typed a command into his keyboard. The screen shifted to display the combined total of every single bank account tied to Bradley Patricia and the commercial real estate company. The number glaring back at me from the white wall was staggering. It was less than $2,000. They had absolutely nothing. Their liquid assets were effectively zero. Bradley was a man standing on the train tracks, completely frozen, watching a massive freight train speeding directly toward him, with no way to jump out of the way. The profound silence in the basement was deafening. The final massive puzzle piece clicked into place with absolute terrifying clarity. The entire lawsuit had absolutely nothing to do with my daughter or her college tuition. Sarah dropping out of her university classes was not a tragedy caused by my lack of financial support. It was a calculated sacrifice. Patricia and Bradley were literally days away from losing their entire fake empire. They were utterly desperate. They looked around their sinking ship, realized they had alienated everyone they knew, and decided that the quiet, dependable retired engineer was their only remaining lifeline. They actively directed an employee to forge a legally binding marital addendum for $150,000 because that was the exact amount they needed to cover the $95,000 balloon payment, pay off their immediate credit card minimums, and keep their pathetic illusion alive for a few more months. They were willing to commit a severe felony to steal my life savings just to save his fragile ego. I did not feel angry. I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute power. I knew exactly how to destroy them. I sat in the dim light of the basement office and let the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin sink into my bones. The crumbling corporate empire of my former rival was a fascinating disaster to witness. But my mind kept returning to the very origin of this entire legal nightmare. I asked William to pull up the specific financial records regarding my daughter and her university expenses. The entire premise of their massive civil lawsuit was built upon the claim that my refusal to pay her tuition was actively destroying her academic future. If they were legally demanding $150,000 to secure her education, I wanted to see exactly where her previous tuition payments had gone. William nodded, and his fingers flew across the keyboard. He opened a new folder containing the bank statements for Sarah and her personal checking account. We traced the money flowing into her account from the previous semester. Everything looked normal at first glance, but William possessed the sharp eyes of a federal investigator. He noticed a massive discrepancy in the timeline of the most recent transactions. He cross-referenced her bank statements with the official university billing schedule that we had legally subpoenaed during the discovery phase. He pointed to a specific date on the screen. The university required all tuition payments for the current semester to be submitted by the second week of September. But there was no outgoing wire transfer to the university anywhere in September. There was no cashier check written to the registrar. In fact, the only large sum of money moving through her checking account was a partial tuition refund issued directly from the university billing office. I leaned closer to the projected screen and stared at the glowing numbers. I asked William to trace the origin of that specific refund check. He opened the digital copy of her official student transcript, which had been reluctantly buried at the very bottom of the discovery files by their legal team. He zoomed in on the section detailing the current academic semester. The page did not list a schedule of advanced honors classes. It did not display any midterm grades or laboratory fees. Across the center of the official university document, printed in stark black letters, was a single devastating word: withdrawn. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. I told William to check the exact date of her official academic withdrawal. He highlighted the timestamp at the bottom of the registrar page. Sarah had formally dropped out of all her classes and completely severed her ties with the degree program more than 4 entire weeks ago. The timeline hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. She had withdrawn a full month before she ever sent me that demanding text message claiming her tuition autodraft had failed. She had dropped out weeks before the process server showed up at my front door with a heavy legal binder claiming my cruelty was ruining her education. The absolute and disgusting truth was completely laid bare in front of me. Sarah was not a dedicated student panicking about losing her classes. She was not a tragic victim of my supposed financial neglect. She was an active, willing, and eager participant in a massive criminal extortion plot. The entire lawsuit was a complete and total sham. There was absolutely no college tuition due. There were no academic classes to save. She and her mother had actively conspired with Bradley to invent a completely fake educational emergency. They weaponized my deep love for her and my long history of paying her academic bills to set a legal trap. They needed exactly $150,000 to pay off the disastrous commercial balloon payment and keep their luxurious illusion alive. So they looked at me and saw nothing but a naive old man waiting to be slaughtered for his money. A cold and heavy disgust settled deep inside my chest. For the past 10 years, I had always held on to a tiny sliver of hope that Sarah was simply manipulated by her mother and blinded by the flashy lifestyle. I always told myself that deep down she was still the sweet girl who used to help me read engineering blueprints on Sunday mornings. But looking at the undeniable proof of her active participation in this fraud completely killed that final shred of hope. She had willingly sold out her own biological father to save the fragile ego and the crumbling fake empire of a man she chose to call her stepfather. She had crossed a moral line so dark and so greedy that there was absolutely no coming back. I stood up from the chair in the quiet basement office. I thanked William for his incredible work. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. It was time to stop gathering evidence and start building the guillotine. I drove back to my house in complete silence. The revelation I had just uncovered in that basement office completely altered the landscape of my reality. I was no longer an old man trying to shield himself from a greedy family. I was a man standing over a highly volatile bomb that was already ticking down to zero. Patricia and Sarah had built their entire fraudulent lawsuit on the assumption that I would simply curl up into a defensive ball and eventually hand over my money out of pure exhaustion. They expected me to hire a lawyer to gently negotiate a settlement. They never expected me to look directly into the deep financial abyss they had dug for themselves. As I pulled my reliable truck into my driveway, I made a profound and irreversible decision. I was not going to simply present William and his accounting evidence to the judge to get the lawsuit dismissed. A simple dismissal would only send them scrambling to find another victim to rob. It would allow Bradley to file a standard bankruptcy and quietly slip away from the devastation he caused. I did not want them to simply fail. I wanted to be the exact reason they failed. I wanted to hold the absolute authority over their financial execution. To execute the strategy forming in my mind, I needed a massive amount of leverage. In the corporate world, leverage always translates to cold, liquid cash. I walked into my quiet home and went straight to my office. I sat down at my desk and opened my primary financial portfolios. I had spent 40 long years working as a civil engineer. I woke up at 5 in the morning every single day. I packed my own lunches. I drove sensible vehicles and I lived in a modest home. I did all of this to build an ironclad retirement fund. My portfolios were carefully divided into long-term municipal bonds, high-yield mutual funds, and secure corporate stocks. It was a beautiful and meticulous financial architecture designed to keep me safe for the rest of my natural life. I looked at the glowing numbers on my computer screen. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to tear down my own walls to build a weapon. The private equity firm holding the debt on Bradley and his flagship commercial property would not accept a handshake or a promise. They only cared about immediate capital. If I wanted to step into their shoes and become the absolute owner of his impending destruction, I had to buy his distressed commercial loan directly from them. I navigated to the trading section of my brokerage account. I selected my most lucrative long-term index funds. These were investments that had been steadily growing untouched for over 2 decades. Liquidating them abruptly, without proper warning or market timing, meant I was going to trigger a catastrophic cascade of capital gains taxes and severe broker penalty fees. I was essentially setting a large portion of my own hard-earned wealth on fire just to generate immediate liquidity. A brief wave of physical nausea washed over me. Every financial instinct I possessed screamed at me to stop. I remembered the freezing winter mornings I spent walking building sites, just to put those specific dollars away for my future. But then I remembered the gold lettering on the university invitation. I remembered the text message from my daughter treating me like a broken automated teller machine. I remembered the unmitigated arrogance of a man who used a forged legal document to try and steal my dignity. The nausea instantly vanished. It was replaced by a cold, mechanical resolve. I began clicking the sell buttons. I authorized the immediate liquidation of 3 massive mutual funds. I broke the maturity dates on a series of highly lucrative municipal bonds. I watched the screen as the trade confirmations rapidly filled my digital inbox. The warning messages regarding massive tax liabilities flashed across my monitor in bright red letters. I ignored every single one of them. I was absorbing a massive financial blow, but I considered it the absolute necessary cost of war. You cannot destroy a fortified enemy without spending your own ammunition. Within 45 minutes, the complex web of my secure retirement investments was reduced to a massive pool of completely liquid cash sitting in a single clearing account. The money would officially settle into my primary bank by tomorrow morning. I had successfully generated more than enough capital to completely swallow the $95,000 balloon payment and purchase the commercial debt outright. I closed my web browser and leaned back in my leather chair. I took a deep breath of the quiet air in my office. My financial safety net was severely damaged, but my hands were completely full of power. I picked up my cellular phone and scrolled through my contacts. I found the direct number for Michael Gallagher. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to call my ruthless attorney and tell him exactly how we were going to buy the man who stole my family. I did not wait until the next morning to contact Michael Gallagher. I picked up my phone and called his direct office line immediately after the liquid cash settled into my primary clearing account. He answered on the second ring, sounding strictly professional and slightly rushed. I told him to clear his schedule for the next hour because I was driving downtown and we needed to have a face-to-face conversation. He tried to ask me if the forensic accountant had found a solid defense against the forged contract. I told him William had found something infinitely better than a simple defense. He had found the exact location of the enemy powder keg, and I had just purchased the match. I hung up the phone before he could ask another question. I grabbed my heavy coat and drove straight back to the towering glass skyscraper in the center of the city. I walked into his corner office and sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk. Gallagher looked at me with a sharp, curious expression. He had a yellow legal pad ready and his expensive silver pen poised over the paper. He assumed I was there to discuss our strategy for the upcoming civil court hearing. He started explaining how we could use the financial discrepancies to force the judge to throw the entire lawsuit in the garbage. He laid out a very neat and clean defensive plan that would protect my retirement assets and send my former wife and her desperate husband packing. I listened to him for 2 minutes before I held up my hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I told him we were no longer playing defense. I told him that simply making the lawsuit go away was completely unacceptable. I looked at my lawyer and spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent 4 decades building load-bearing structures. I explained that when a civil engineer finds a massive crack in a concrete foundation, you do not simply paint over it and pretend the building is safe. You tear the entire compromised structure down to the dirt so it can never collapse and hurt anyone else. I told him that Bradley Winston was a compromised structure. He built his entire life on predatory loans and fake wealth. He used that fake wealth to steal my family, and then he actively tried to use the legal system to steal my life savings to cover his tracks. I told Gallagher that if we just dismissed the lawsuit, Bradley would simply find another way to survive. He would file a standard bankruptcy, restructure his hidden debt, and eventually crawl out from under the rubble to manipulate someone else. I wanted to guarantee his absolute and permanent financial demolition. Gallagher leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He asked me exactly what I had in mind. I leaned forward and placed my hands flat on his polished mahogany desk. I told him about the non-negotiable balloon payment looming over the flagship commercial property. I explained that the private equity firm holding the paper was expecting $95,000 by 5 in the afternoon on Friday. Then I looked directly into his eyes and told him I had just liquidated my primary retirement portfolios. I told him I had hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure liquid cash sitting in my checking account and ready to deploy. I did not want him to call the judge. I wanted him to call the private equity firm. I instructed my lawyer to formally approach the original lender and offer to purchase the distressed commercial debt outright. The ruthless corporate litigator sat completely frozen in his chair. He stared at me in absolute stunned silence. He processed the sheer magnitude of what I was asking him to do. If we successfully bought the debt from the private equity firm, we would legally step into their shoes. We would hold the master mortgage on the flagship property. The $95,000 payment would no longer be owed to a faceless corporate bank. It would be owed directly to me. I would legally become the absolute master of his financial survival. A slow, dangerous smile spread across the face of Michael Gallagher. He dropped his silver pen onto the legal pad and let out a low whistle. He looked at me not as an old retired engineer, but as a lethal predator. He picked up his office telephone and told me we were going to buy a building. I arrived at the towering glass building at 8 in the morning on the day of the formal legal depositions. The sky outside the massive windows was a brilliant and clear blue, but the atmosphere inside the law firm was as cold and sterile as an operating room. Michael Gallagher had intentionally reserved his largest and most intimidating conference room for this specific occasion. The room featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a sweeping view of the city skyline, but I was entirely uninterested in the beautiful view. I sat down in a heavy leather executive chair at the far end of the long, polished mahogany table. A certified court reporter was already seated quietly in the corner, methodically setting up her stenography machine to record every single syllable spoken on the official legal record. Gallagher sat to my right, organizing a pristine stack of thick blue legal folders. He did not speak a word to me. We had already finalized our brutal strategy the night before. Today was entirely about flawless execution. I folded my hands together on the cold table and waited in absolute silence. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Patricia walked into the room first, followed closely by Sarah and Bradley. They brought a young, aggressive-looking attorney with them, who immediately began pulling out chairs and unpacking a shiny leather briefcase. My former family did not look like people who were terrified of a massive financial audit. They walked into that conference room oozing absolute arrogance and unearned confidence. Patricia was wearing a tailored designer suit and a heavy gold necklace that I now knew was financed on a high-interest revolving credit card. Bradley wore a custom silk tie and shot me a pathetic, condescending smirk as he took his seat directly across from me. He genuinely believed his desperate phone call had successfully intimidated me, and that this deposition was merely a brief formality before I handed over a massive settlement check. Sarah sat down next to her mother, intentionally refusing to make eye contact with me. She was actively playing the role of the deeply traumatized victim, deliberately adjusting her posture to look small and fragile while clutching a white tissue in her hands. I watched the three of them settle into their expensive chairs with a profound sense of clarity. 10 years ago, seeing them sitting together, acting like a superior and united front, would have caused a deep and painful ache in my chest. I would have felt the sharp sting of rejection and the heavy burden of my own supposed inadequacy. But sitting across from them now, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold and clinical detachment. I did not see a wealthy real estate mogul, a glamorous former wife, and a brilliant, dedicated university student. I saw three desperate and drowning people frantically clinging to a sinking ship of toxic corporate debt. I knew exactly how much money was remaining in their bank accounts. I knew exactly when their massive commercial loans were due to expire. I knew they were entirely broke and actively committing a severe felony just to survive another 30 days. Yet they sat there projecting an aura of absolute invincibility to the room. It was a fascinating and disgusting psychological display. They were entirely convinced that I was the naive old fool who had walked blindly into their legal trap. They had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath their feet had already vanished. Their young attorney puffed out his chest and loudly cleared his throat. He aggressively demanded that we wrap this procedure up quickly, claiming his clients were incredibly important people who did not have time to waste on frivolous legal delays. He clearly thought he was dealing with a frightened retired civil engineer who was terrified of courtroom confrontation. I did not flinch. I did not offer a polite smile or a defensive verbal response. I maintained a profound and heavy silence. I simply stared directly into the eyes of Bradley Winston without blinking. My total lack of reaction clearly unnerved him. His condescending smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and he nervously adjusted the expensive silk tie around his neck. He was expecting me to look defeated or angry. He was not expecting the dead calm of a man who legally held the absolute power of his entire financial life in his hands. Gallagher finally broke the silence. He ignored the aggressive posturing of the opposing lawyer completely. He turned his head to the court reporter and instructed her to swear in the witnesses. The reporter asked Patricia and Sarah to raise their right hands and formally swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth under the absolute penalty of perjury. They both confidently raised their hands and swore the legally binding oath. The heavy steel doors of the trap officially slammed shut behind them. The opposing attorney began the formal questioning with Patricia. He paced slowly in front of the massive glass wall, asking her incredibly gentle and leading questions. He treated her as if she were a fragile survivor of a tyrannical and abusive former husband. Patricia sat up perfectly straight in her designer leather chair. She adjusted her heavy gold necklace, a piece of jewelry I now knew was financed on a high-interest revolving credit card, and spoke with a voice completely dripping with artificial sincerity. She painted a vivid and completely fabricated picture of a chilly Tuesday afternoon exactly 5 years ago. She claimed that I had visited her sprawling glass mansion to drop off a belated birthday gift for Sarah. She stated that during this imaginary visit I was suddenly overcome with a deep and overwhelming sense of paternal guilt. According to her elaborate and theatrical narrative, I sat down at her expensive marble dining table and tearfully confessed that I had been a terrible father. She claimed I desperately wanted to secure Sarah financially for the rest of her young adult life to make up for my emotional absence. She described my slumped posture, my supposed apologetic words, and even the expensive blue ink pen I supposedly pulled from my jacket pocket. It was a masterful, highly detailed performance. If I had not been the man sitting directly across the table, I might have actually believed her deeply moving story. The young lawyer walked back to the conference table and picked up a clean copy of the forged marital addendum. He held the thick document up in the bright morning air so the certified court reporter could clearly see the text. He asked Patricia to officially identify the paper for the legal record. She leaned forward, squinted slightly, as if she were carefully examining the complex legal jargon, and slowly nodded her head. She confidently stated that it was the exact contract we had discussed on that chilly afternoon. The lawyer then asked the most critical question of the entire morning. He asked her if she physically watched me sign my legal name on that specific piece of paper. Patricia looked directly into my eyes across the polished mahogany table. She did not blink. She did not hesitate or look away. She spoke in a loud, clear, and perfectly steady voice. She swore under the absolute penalty of perjury that she stood right next to my shoulder and watched me physically sign the contract. She cemented her massive lie into the official legal record. She had just committed a severe state felony while staring directly into the eyes of her former husband. The young attorney thanked Patricia and gently shifted his attention to my daughter. Sarah immediately changed her entire physical posture. She hunched her shoulders forward, making herself look incredibly small and deeply vulnerable. She pulled a fresh white tissue from her expensive designer purse and clutched it tightly in both hands. The lawyer asked her to describe her current academic situation at the university. Sarah let out a long, trembling sigh. She began to speak in a quiet, fractured voice that sounded exactly like a frightened and abandoned child. She talked about how incredibly hard she had worked to maintain her position in the prestigious honors program. She described the grueling late-night study hours the incredibly difficult midterm exams she was supposedly preparing for, and her profound dedication to earning her advanced degree. She painted herself as a brilliant, exhausted, and devoted student who was simply trying to build a positive future for herself. Every single word she spoke was a meticulously rehearsed and calculated lie. I sat there silently remembering the official registrar document resting safely inside the blue folder of my lawyer. I remembered the single black word stamped across her official transcript: withdrawn. She was talking passionately about attending university classes she had completely abandoned over a month ago. The opposing lawyer stepped much closer to Sarah and lowered his voice to a highly sympathetic whisper. He asked her to explain exactly what would happen to her bright academic future if the court did not force me to honor the financial contract today. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and forced a single highly dramatic tear to roll down her cheek. She took a shaky breath and delivered the final devastating blow. She swore under oath that the university registrar had given her an absolute and final deadline. She testified that if my tuition payment was not fully processed by tomorrow morning, she would be immediately and permanently expelled from the entire state university system. She looked directly at the court reporter and claimed that my extreme financial cruelty was intentionally designed to destroy her entire life. She stated that I was a bitter, jealous, and vindictive man who wanted to punish her simply because she loved her wealthy stepfather more than me. She wiped her fake tears and locked her eyes onto mine, desperately waiting for me to break down or explode in rage. I did not move a single muscle in my body. I sat perfectly still, silently absorbing every single lie. They had successfully built their entire fragile house of cards on the official legal record. They had confidently handed us the absolute proof of their crimes. Now it was our turn to strike the match and burn it all to the ground. The young opposing attorney slowly walked back to his leather chair and sat down. He wore a deeply triumphant expression, clearly believing he had successfully painted me as a cruel monster on the official legal record. He formally stated that he had absolutely no further questions for my daughter. The massive conference room fell completely silent. The only sound was the soft rhythmic tapping of the court reporter pressing the keys on her stenography machine. Sarah continued to hold her white tissue, letting out small, carefully calculated sniffles to maintain the grand illusion of her profound emotional heartbreak. Michael Gallagher did not immediately stand up. He sat perfectly still next to me and slowly opened the thick blue legal folder resting on the polished mahogany table. He did not look angry or intimidated. He looked incredibly bored. He finally looked up at Sarah and asked her to confirm her previous testimony one final time for the absolute clarity of the legal record. He asked her if she was entirely certain that she was currently enrolled in advanced academic classes and facing imminent university expulsion tomorrow morning. Sarah nodded her head emphatically. She spoke into the quiet room and swore once again that her entire educational future was resting solely on my immediate financial payment. Gallagher reached into his pristine blue folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper. He did not yell or dramatically wave the document in the air to create a theatrical scene. He simply placed his hand flat on the paper and slowly slid it across the long wooden table. The document came to a smooth stop directly in front of the opposing attorney. Gallagher calmly instructed the young lawyer to closely examine the official raised seal stamped at the very top of the page. He then asked him to read the primary contents aloud so the court reporter could accurately transcribe the information. The young attorney picked up the paper with a deeply confused expression. He casually glanced at the official letterhead of the State University Registrar Office. His eyes quickly scanned down to the bold text printed across the center of the page. I watched the triumphant arrogance completely drain out of his young face in a single fraction of a second. The healthy pink color rapidly left his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. He simply stared at the official paper as if it had suddenly caught fire in his trembling hands. Gallagher did not wait for the young lawyer to recover his voice or his composure. My attorney turned his sharp attention back to my daughter, sitting across the table. He spoke in a crisp, highly authoritative tone that easily cut through the heavy silence like a sharp steel blade. He informed the entire room that the piece of paper currently resting on the table was a legally certified copy of her official university academic transcript. He explicitly stated that we had lawfully subpoenaed the document directly from the university billing office during the mandatory civil discovery phase. He then looked directly into the wide eyes of my daughter and read the exact dates printed on the official state record. He noted that she had not attended a single academic lecture or laboratory session in over 5 entire weeks. He pointed out that her student tuition account had actually been credited with a substantial partial financial refund. He then raised his voice just enough to ensure the court reporter captured every single devastating syllable. He stated that Sarah Winston had formally and voluntarily withdrawn from the entire university system a full month before she ever filed this massive civil extortion lawsuit. The calculated sniffles echoing from my daughter instantly stopped dead. The fake tears glistening on her cheeks dried up in a matter of seconds. She dropped the crumpled white tissue onto the polished table. Her eyes widened in absolute naked terror. She looked wildly at her mother for some kind of immediate rescue. Patricia let out a sharp gasp and tightly covered her mouth with both hands, finally realizing they had walked completely blindly into a fatal legal trap. Bradley Winston violently gripped the armrests of his heavy leather chair. His condescending smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked realization that their massive extortion plot had just spectacularly imploded on the permanent legal record. The young opposing attorney suddenly threw the certified letter down on the table and pushed his chair back violently. He realized his own clients had actively lied to him and manipulated him into presenting fabricated evidence to a sworn officer of the court. He began frantically whispering to Bradley, his voice trembling with genuine professional fear. The pristine, arrogant atmosphere of the glass conference room instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer untouchable predators demanding a massive cash settlement. They were 3 desperate criminals trapped in a locked room, rapidly suffocating under the crushing weight of their own documented lies. The young opposing attorney was still staring at the certified university transcript, his breathing incredibly shallow and rapid. He looked exactly like a man who had just realized he was driving a stolen vehicle straight into a solid concrete wall. Bradley Winston was fiercely whispering at him, demanding he do something to fix the catastrophic error. But Michael Gallagher was not finished. He did not give them a single moment to catch their breath or formulate a new lie. He reached his hand back into the pristine blue folder. The entire room went completely still. Even Bradley abruptly stopped his frantic whispering. They all stared at the hand of my lawyer, as if he were pulling the pin from a live explosive. Gallagher pulled out a thick stack of papers bound by a heavy black clip. He did not slide this document across the table. He held it firmly in his hands, completely commanding the immediate attention of every single person in the room. He looked directly at Bradley, his eyes utterly devoid of any human warmth or professional courtesy. Gallagher began to speak in a low and carefully measured voice. He explained that when a person creates a digital document on a modern computer, the machine automatically records a microscopic trail of evidence hidden deep within the digital file itself. He called it digital metadata. He explained that this invisible fingerprint permanently records the exact date and time the file was created, the specific user profile that created it, and the unique hardware identification number of the machine used. He then informed the breathless room that during the mandatory civil discovery phase, he had legally subpoenaed not just the physical paper copy of the supposedly binding marital addendum, but the original digital file that the notary public had claimed to print and stamp. Gallagher slowly flipped open the thick stack of technical papers. He stated that he had hired an independent and court-certified cyber forensics expert to extract and strictly analyze every single piece of metadata attached to their forged financial contract. He looked down at the highlighted page and began reading the undeniable results aloud. He stated that the digital file was not created 5 years ago on a chilly afternoon, like they had just sworn under oath. It was created exactly 4 weeks and 2 days ago. He read the exact timestamp of its original creation down to the very second. He then read the registered owner of the software license used to draft the document. He paused deliberately, letting the heavy silence stretch across the conference room, before loudly speaking the name, Winston Commercial Real Estate. He did not stop there. He read the unique Internet Protocol address and the physical hardware registry of the exact computer where the fraudulent file was originated. He looked directly into the terrified eyes of Bradley Winston and stated that the computer in question was currently sitting on the desk of an administrative assistant named Kelly Higgins. The healthy pink color completely drained from the face of the wealthy real estate developer. His jaw actually dropped open in pure shock. He suddenly realized that we had not just found a minor chronological flaw in their fabricated story. We had forensically documented their exact crime down to the very keyboard they used to commit it. Gallagher gently closed the thick technical report and placed it flat on the polished mahogany table. He turned his sharp gaze toward Patricia, who was currently trembling so violently that her expensive leather chair was actually shaking against the floor. He spoke to her with absolute and terrifying clarity. He reminded her that less than 10 minutes ago she had confidently sworn a legally binding oath before a certified officer of the court. He pointed his finger directly at the court reporter, whose hands were still methodically pressing the keys of her machine, recording every single devastating word. He stated that Patricia had explicitly testified to physically witnessing a man sign a document that did not even exist until 4 weeks ago. He informed her that she had just committed felony perjury on the official legal record. He then looked at Bradley and Sarah, pulling their entire pathetic conspiracy into the harsh light of reality. He stated that they had knowingly colluded to fabricate a fraudulent financial contract, utilize a fraudulent notary seal, and actively attempt to use the state judicial system to extort a massive sum of money. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold table, and delivered the final, undeniable kill shot. He told them they were no longer simply greedy plaintiffs in a failing civil lawsuit. They were documented felons facing an active criminal conspiracy charge, and he possessed the absolute forensic proof required to send every single one of them to a federal penitentiary. I sat at the end of the long table and watched the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to erase me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I watched the arrogant facade of my former wife completely melt away, leaving behind nothing but the naked terror of a criminal caught entirely in the act. I watched my daughter physically shrink into her chair, realizing that her willing participation in this massive fraud was going to permanently brand her as a felon before her adult life even truly began. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, as if my lawyer had simply suffocated their entire fake empire with a single stack of paper. The absolute silence in the glass conference room lasted for exactly 5 seconds. It was the profound quiet of a massive structure completely collapsing under its own weight. Then the pristine illusion of their wealthy united front violently shattered. Patricia did not hesitate to save herself. She did not look at her husband with sympathy or solidarity. The sheer terror of a federal prison sentence stripped away every single ounce of her fabricated elegance. She violently pushed her heavy leather chair away from the table and stood up. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Bradley Winston and began to scream. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged, echoing off the thick glass walls. She yelled that she had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of the digital file. She screamed that the entire fraudulent contract was entirely his idea from the very beginning. She threw the man she had left me for directly under the treads of a massive speeding train, without a single second of hesitation or regret. Bradley desperately tried to grab her arm to silence her, but she physically swatted his hand away. She looked wildly at my attorney and began frantically confessing every single detail of their toxic financial disaster on the official legal record. She cried out that Bradley was completely bankrupt. She screamed that they were going to lose their massive glass mansion by the end of the current month because he could not pay his commercial loans. She openly admitted that he had forced his administrative assistant to draft the fake addendum because they desperately needed my retirement money to cover his incoming balloon payment. She painted herself as a helpless, terrified victim of his desperate corporate scheming, claiming she only went along with the extortion lawsuit because he threatened to leave her completely penniless on the street. The young opposing attorney did not try to stop her frantic confession or protect his clients. He was already rapidly shoving his legal pads and expensive pens into his leather briefcase. He snapped the heavy clasps shut, stood up, and formally announced to the room that he was immediately withdrawing as their legal counsel due to a catastrophic criminal conflict of interest. He turned around and walked straight out of the heavy glass doors without looking back, abandoning them entirely to their fate. The sudden departure of their lawyer seemed to finally break the last remaining shred of their sanity. Patricia turned her frantic, terrified eyes toward me. Sarah followed her mother, perfectly mirroring her absolute panic. They both suddenly remembered that I was the man they used to call family. Patricia clasped her hands together tightly and began to beg. The woman who had proudly mocked my sensible financial planning for an entire decade was now openly weeping and pleading for my mercy. She begged me to instruct my lawyer to destroy the forensic evidence. She promised they would completely drop the civil lawsuit today and never ask me for another dime as long as they lived. Sarah leaned across the polished mahogany table and cried out for her father. The daughter who had eagerly erased my last name from her life suddenly wanted to be my little girl again. She cried that a felony conviction would permanently destroy her future career. She begged me to forgive them, because deep down we were still a family, and family protects each other. I sat perfectly still and listened to their desperate, pathetic pleas echoing in the room. I looked at the heavy tears streaming down their faces. I felt absolutely no warmth. I felt no lingering parental guilt. I felt the absolute cold clarity of a man who had finally cut the rotting wood out of his life. I placed my hands flat on the polished table and slowly stood up from my chair. I looked down at the three shattered people sitting in the ruins of their own arrogant greed. I did not raise my voice to yell. I spoke with the quiet, heavy certainty of a judge delivering a final sentence. I looked directly at Patricia and told her that family is built on mutual respect and genuine loyalty, not financial convenience and forged legal documents. I then looked directly into the eyes of Sarah. I told her that she had made her permanent choice the very day she walked into a courthouse and legally became a Winston. I told her that she was a grown adult now, and adults must face the absolute consequences of their own calculated actions. I turned to Michael Gallagher and instructed him to immediately forward the digital forensic report and the certified university transcript directly to the district attorney office. Bradley let out a hollow, devastated sound and buried his face in his trembling hands. Patricia collapsed back into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her palms. I did not stay to watch them cry. I buttoned my coat, turned my back on the people who had tried to destroy me, and walked out of the glass conference room. I stepped into the elevator and rode it down to the ground floor. I walked out of the towering building and into the bright morning sunlight. The civil lawsuit was completely dead, but the true financial execution was just about to begin. I did not go home to rest after walking out of that shattered conference room. Michael Gallagher and I immediately entered his black town car and directed his driver to take us straight to the financial district. We were headed to the regional headquarters of the private equity firm that officially held the master mortgage on Bradley Winston and his flagship commercial property. The environment was entirely different from the sterile legal offices we had just left. This building was a fortress of quiet and absolute wealth. We were escorted into a massive boardroom constructed of dark mahogany and brushed steel. Two senior investment directors entered the room. They wore impeccably tailored suits and looked at me with mild confusion. They were accustomed to dealing with desperate corporate developers begging for loan extensions, not a retired civil engineer wearing a simple canvas jacket. Gallagher did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He opened his leather briefcase and laid the financial reality directly onto the table. He informed the directors that we were fully aware of the $95,000 balloon payment attached to the Winston commercial real estate account. He also explicitly informed them that their client was completely insolvent. Gallagher presented a sanitized and legally permissible summary of the forensic accounting data we had just uncovered. He painted a perfectly accurate picture of a doomed developer who possessed absolutely zero liquid assets and was currently facing massive criminal fraud charges. The faces of the two senior directors instantly hardened. In the ruthless world of high finance, a pending criminal charge against a primary debtor is the ultimate toxic poison. They realized immediately that Bradley was not going to make the Friday afternoon payment. Furthermore, they realized that forcing a property into foreclosure, navigating the complex bankruptcy proceedings, and trying to liquidate a massive commercial office building in a stagnant market would cost their firm months of expensive legal fees and severe administrative headaches. They viewed the Winston property as a rapidly sinking ship, and they were the ones legally chained to the anchor. Gallagher let that grim reality settle over the boardroom for a long moment before he presented our solution. He slid a certified bank document across the dark wood table. It was the absolute proof of the massive liquid funds sitting securely in my primary clearing account. Gallagher looked at the directors and offered them an immediate and perfectly clean exit strategy. He stated that I was prepared to purchase the distressed commercial debt entirely outright right there in the room. I was offering to completely absorb their toxic risk and take the impending foreclosure process entirely off their hands. However, because I was offering immediate and unencumbered liquid cash to solve their massive headache, we demanded a strict discount on the total paper value of the loan. The negotiation that followed was brutally short and entirely devoid of emotion. It was simply the cold mathematics of risk management. The investment directors made a quick phone call to their primary risk assessment officer. They calculated the exorbitant cost of a prolonged legal battle against a bankrupt developer, weighed it against the beautiful simplicity of my immediate cash offer, and made their final decision. They agreed to sell the entire commercial debt portfolio to my newly formed holding company at an 8% discount. A team of corporate lawyers was immediately summoned into the boardroom to expedite the massive transaction. For the next 3 hours, I sat at the heavy mahogany table and systematically signed my legal name to dozens of complex financial transfer documents. I signed away the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had painfully extracted from my retirement accounts. But as I signed the final master contract, I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I felt the immense and undeniable weight of total leverage. The lead investment director shook my hand and handed me a thick leather binder containing the original loan agreements, the property deeds, and the legal right of absolute collection. I walked out of the towering financial fortress and stood on the busy city sidewalk with my attorney. The autumn wind was cold, but my mind was completely on fire. I had successfully executed the most aggressive financial maneuver of my entire life. The $95,000 balloon payment was no longer owed to a faceless and indifferent corporate bank. It was legally owed directly to Richard Caldwell. I had completely bypassed the slow and uncertain justice of the criminal court system. I was officially the absolute master of his financial survival. Bradley Winston was scheduled to completely default on his entire existence at exactly 5 on Friday afternoon, and I was the man holding the executioner's sword. I spent the next 48 hours completely unplugged from the chaos I had just unleashed. I did not drive past their massive glass mansion to see if there were moving trucks parked in the driveway. I did not answer any incoming calls from unknown numbers. I simply went back to my modest home and lived my quiet, methodical life. I spent Thursday afternoon working in my garage, carefully sanding and restraining an old wooden workbench. It was the exact kind of mundane physical labor that my former wife used to openly despise. But as my hands moved the rough sandpaper over the wood, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the city. I knew that Bradley Winston was currently drowning in a frantic, terrifying scramble for basic survival. I could picture his pathetic panic perfectly. He was likely screaming at his rapidly dwindling office staff, desperately trying to secure a last-minute emergency loan from private investors or shady creditors. He was undoubtedly calling the private equity firm every single hour, begging the senior directors for a 30-day extension. He had absolutely no idea that the investment directors he was begging no longer held the keys to his financial prison. He did not know that his frantic voicemails were being routed to an empty corporate inbox because the massive commercial debt had already been legally transferred to a holding company, completely controlled by the exact man he had just tried to rob. He was a blind man, running full speed toward the edge of a jagged cliff, entirely convinced he was still running on a safe paved road. Friday morning arrived with a cold, heavy rain that washed the city streets clean. I woke up at my usual time, brewed a strong pot of black coffee, and sat at my kitchen island. I did not go out to the garage today. I brought my laptop into the kitchen and opened the secure banking portal for my newly formed holding company. The digital interface was entirely blank. The designated receiving account for the $95,000 balloon payment showed a balance of absolute zero. The terms of the commercial mortgage I had purchased from the equity firm were incredibly strict and completely devoid of any grace periods. The contract explicitly stated that the massive lump sum payment had to be fully processed and cleared by the receiving bank no later than 5 p.m. on this exact calendar day. If the wire transfer did not arrive by that exact minute, the entire loan automatically triggered a catastrophic default clause. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. At noon, the account remained completely empty. At 3 p.m, my cellular phone rang. It was Michael Gallagher. He asked if the money had miraculously appeared in the holding account. I told him the balance was still zero. My lawyer let out a short, cold laugh. He stated that even if Bradley somehow managed to find a desperate loan shark willing to lend him nearly $100,000, the federal banking wire cutoff for the weekend was rapidly approaching. The window for a miraculous rescue was shrinking by the second. We stayed on the phone together, listening to the heavy rain beating against my kitchen window, watching the digital clock on my computer screen slowly march toward the absolute deadline. At 4:55, I felt a strange, heavy stillness settle into my bones. The entire 10-year saga of disrespect, the flashy leased sports cars, the condescending smirks, and the forged legal documents all narrowed down to a single silent countdown. 4:57, 4:58, 4:59. I stared directly at the glowing zero on the banking portal. The digital clock rolled over to exactly 5 p.m. I refreshed the secure web page one final time. The screen loaded instantly. The balance remained perfectly, undeniably at zero. The absolute deadline had officially passed. The banking wire window was permanently closed for the weekend. Bradley Winston had completely failed to make the payment. He was no longer just a struggling real estate developer trying to secure an extension on a bad investment. He was officially and legally in total default. Because of the aggressive cross-default clauses buried deep within his corporate structure, missing this single massive payment automatically triggered a devastating chain reaction. Every other financial institution holding his smaller loans would instantly panic and demand their own immediate payments. He had just lost his flagship commercial property and completely doomed his entire corporate empire. I spoke into the telephone and told my attorney that the account was empty. Gallagher did not celebrate loudly. He simply stated that the trap was completely locked. He told me he would spend the entire weekend drafting the formal notice of default and immediate foreclosure. The legal machinery was fully engaged and completely unstoppable. I hung up the phone and closed my laptop. Bradley was currently sitting in his massive glass mansion, probably believing he could somehow negotiate his way out of this disaster on Monday morning. He had absolutely no idea that his entire empire was already gone, legally seized by the retired engineer he thought he could easily destroy. Monday morning brought a crisp and unforgiving sunlight to the city. I put on my best dark suit, the one I usually reserved for formal engineering banquets, and drove downtown to meet Michael Gallagher. We did not meet at his law firm. We met directly across the street from the towering glass and steel structure that Bradley Winston proudly called the crown jewel of his real estate portfolio. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the massive building. It was an impressive architectural achievement, designed to project absolute power and infinite wealth. The sheer walls of tinted glass reflected the morning sun, perfectly hiding the rotting financial foundation underneath. For 10 years, Bradley had used this exact building as a weapon to make me feel small. He would casually mention the square footage and the prestigious corporate tenants during family dinners just to watch me quietly eat my food. Today, I was not looking at a weapon. I was looking at my own legal property. Gallagher walked up beside me holding a thick leather portfolio. He did not say a single greeting. He simply nodded toward the main entrance. We crossed the busy street together, walking with the slow and deliberate pace of men who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. We pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the expansive main lobby. The interior was deliberately designed to intimidate anyone who walked inside. The floors were cut from imported Italian marble. A massive modern chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a cold white light over the expensive leather waiting chairs and the sleek granite security desk. But despite the luxurious cosmetic shell, the atmosphere inside the room was incredibly chaotic and thick with panic. The polished illusion of a smooth corporate operation was completely fractured. A loud crowd of angry men wearing heavy work boots and reflective construction vests stood clustered near the center of the expansive lobby. They were holding clipboards and aggressively waving unpaid invoices in the air. These were the private contractors, the electricians, the plumbers, and the structural carpenters who actually kept the massive building functioning and safe. They were fiercely demanding their money. And standing directly in the center of the angry circle, completely surrounded by the men he owed, was the supposedly wealthy real estate mogul himself. Bradley Winston looked absolutely terrible. The man who always wore custom-tailored suits and a perfectly practiced condescending smirk was currently unraveling in real time. His expensive silk tie was loosened and hanging crookedly around his sweating neck. His face was flushed dark red, and his hair was uncharacteristically messy. He was shouting frantically at the lead contractor, waving his hands in the air and making aggressive, desperate promises. He was loudly claiming that there was simply a minor clerical error with his primary banking institution. He promised the angry men that the massive wire transfers would clear by tomorrow afternoon and begged them to send their crews back to work immediately. He was actively lying to their faces to buy himself another 24 hours of survival. He had absolutely no idea that the bank had already completely locked his corporate accounts due to the catastrophic default he triggered on Friday afternoon. I stopped walking and simply watched him thrash around in the deep water. I watched the fake billionaire desperately beg the working-class men he usually ignored just to keep his sinking ship afloat for one more day. It was a profoundly pathetic sight to witness. The supreme arrogance that had fueled his entire miserable existence was completely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow fraud fighting for scraps. I did not feel a single drop of pity for him. I felt the absolute cold certainty of a civil engineer watching a condemned building prepare for an explosive demolition. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and began walking directly toward the center of the chaotic circle. Gallagher matched my pace perfectly, walking half a step behind me, like a silent shadow carrying a loaded weapon inside his leather folder. The heavy, solid sound of our leather shoes echoing against the marble floor seemed to cut straight through the shouting and the noise. One by one, the angry contractors noticed us approaching and slowly stepped aside, sensing a massive shift in the atmosphere. The tight circle opened up, leaving a clear physical path directly to Bradley. He stopped mid-sentence and turned around to face the new disruption. When his bloodshot eyes finally locked onto my calm face, his expression fractured into absolute profound confusion. He was expecting to see angry bank managers or aggressive private investors coming to collect their debts. He was absolutely not expecting to see the retired civil engineer he had just tried to rob walking through his lobby. The sheer sight of me standing there, calm and completely in control, caused the last remaining shreds of his composure to instantly vaporize. He opened his mouth to speak, but he could not find a single coherent word. The angry contractors formed a tight ring around us, completely silent now, watching the strange dynamic unfold in the center of the lobby. Bradley stared at me, his chest heaving under his wrinkled silk shirt. He tried to quickly recover his shattered pride and project an aura of authority. He forced a pathetic, condescending smile onto his sweating face. He aggressively told me I had a massive amount of nerve showing up uninvited at his private corporate property. He loudly proclaimed to the entire room that if I was there to gloat about the failure of the civil lawsuit, I was entirely wasting my time. He tried to act like a powerful man, merely experiencing a temporary setback, claiming his lawyers were already drafting a new legal strategy to punish me for my insolence. He desperately wanted the men surrounding him to believe he was still in absolute control. I did not react to his frantic bluster. I looked at the dark sweat stains spreading under the arms of his expensive custom suit jacket. I looked at his trembling hands. I felt the absolute certainty of a man holding the winning hand in a high-stakes game. I told him I did not care about his fabricated civil lawsuit anymore. I told him that the failed extortion attempt was the absolute least of his current problems. I turned slightly to my right, where Michael Gallagher stood perfectly still. My attorney unzipped his heavy black leather portfolio. The sharp metallic sound of the zipper echoed loudly in the quiet marble lobby. He reached inside this dark leather case and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers bound by a heavy red clip. This was not a standard civil complaint or a polite request for financial discovery. This was a completely lethal financial weapon engineered to destroy an empire. Gallagher did not speak to Bradley. He handed the heavy stack of papers directly to me. I took the documents in my hands, feeling the profound physical weight of the paper. This single stack of legal forms represented the culmination of some of my liquidated retirement funds, the countless hours of forensic accounting, and the absolute destruction of his fraudulent reality. I stepped much closer to Bradley, invading his personal space. I held the documents out toward him. He looked at the papers as if they were covered in a deadly physical venom. He stubbornly refused to raise his hands to accept them. I did not pull the papers back or wait for his permission. I simply pushed the heavy stack directly against his chest, forcing his natural physical instinct to take over. He reflexively grabbed the thick stack to keep it from falling onto the polished marble floor. I instructed him to read the bold black letters printed across the very top of the first page. I spoke in a clear, carrying voice, ensuring every single unpaid contractor standing in the lobby could hear exactly what was happening to their wealthy boss. I told him he was currently holding a formal notice of default and immediate foreclosure. Bradley blinked rapidly, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. He still did not fully comprehend the terrifying reality of his situation. His brain simply could not process the mathematics of his own destruction. He stammered weakly, arguing that his massive commercial mortgage was legally held by a private equity firm. He aggressively claimed that I had absolutely no legal authority to serve him foreclosure papers on a corporate property. I let a cold, hard smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told him the private equity firm no longer cared about his flagship property. I explained that I had personally visited their regional headquarters on Wednesday afternoon. I told him I had completely liquidated my own secure retirement accounts to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure liquid cash. I watched his face pale as I explained that I had purchased his distressed commercial debt entirely outright from his original lender. I told him the massive $95,000 balloon payment was due at exactly 5 in the afternoon on Friday. I reminded him that his banking wire had completely failed to arrive. I watched the horrible truth slowly penetrate his thick, arrogant skull. I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a harsh mechanical whisper that only he could fully absorb. I told him I was no longer just the pathetic retired engineer he used to mock at family dinners. I was officially his bank. I was his primary secured creditor. I legally held the master mortgage on the very building we were standing inside. I told him he had completely failed to pay me my money, and because of his absolute failure, I was legally seizing his flagship property, effective immediately. I told him to turn to the final page and look at the signature authorizing the massive foreclosure. It was not a faceless corporate investment director. It was my name. Richard Caldwell. Bradley stared down at the heavy black ink resting at the bottom of the formal foreclosure document. The letters formed a name he had spent the last 10 years treating like absolute dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. He read my printed name once. He read it a second time. His arrogant brain actively fought against the terrifying new information. The man standing perfectly calm in front of him was supposed to be a pathetic retired civil engineer. I was supposed to be the weak old fool they could easily manipulate into paying a massive civil settlement to save their failing empire. Bradley looked up from the paper and stared directly into my eyes. The angry flush of color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. The absolute reality of his situation finally crushed the breath out of his lungs. I had not merely defeated his fraudulent lawsuit in a closed conference room. I had actively hunted down his deepest financial vulnerability and legally bought his entire miserable existence. The silence in the massive marble lobby became absolute and heavy. Even the large crowd of angry unpaid contractors completely stopped breathing. They stood in a tight circle and watched the wealthy real estate mogul completely break apart. Bradley let out a strange, hollow sound from the back of his throat. It was not a coherent word. It was the primal, terrified noise of a cornered animal realizing the steel trap was perfectly sealed. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy legal documents slipped from his sweating fingers and scattered across the polished Italian marble floor. He looked wildly around the beautiful lobby of his flagship commercial property. He looked at the massive glass walls, the expensive leather waiting chairs, and the sleek granite security desk. He suddenly understood that he did not own a single piece of it anymore. Everything he had built his entire identity upon was legally gone, completely stripped away by the man he despised the most. The pure terror in his wide eyes rapidly mutated into a blind, violently explosive rage. He simply could not accept the profound public humiliation of being completely destroyed by his perceived inferior. He let out a furious scream and lunged directly across the small space separating us. He raised his fists, aiming straight for my face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of corporate dignity or legal caution. He wanted to physically destroy the man who had systematically dismantled his fake reality. I did not flinch. I did not step back or raise my hands to defend myself. I stood perfectly still on the cold marble floor because I knew exactly what was about to happen. Before Bradley could even close the short distance, a massive physical force abruptly stopped his forward momentum. Two large men wearing crisp, dark uniforms stepped smoothly out from the shadows near the granite reception desk. They moved with absolute practiced efficiency. One security guard grabbed Bradley by his right shoulder and violently twisted his arm securely behind his back. The second guard seized his left wrist completely, immobilizing the desperate developer in a painful mechanical lock. Bradley struggled furiously, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the marble floor and screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded that the guards release him immediately. He screamed that he was the wealthy owner of the building and that he would personally fire them and ruin their lives for daring to lay their hands on him. He thrashed blindly, demanding absolute obedience from the men he firmly believed were his own loyal employees. I stepped forward and looked down at the pathetic, struggling man. I spoke in a calm, authoritative voice that easily carried across the silent lobby. I told him he could not fire the security team. I explained that when my holding company legally seized the flagship property at exactly 5 p.m. on Friday, we also automatically assumed total legal control of all active vendor contracts. I looked deeply into his wild, terrified eyes and delivered the final, absolute truth. I told him the guards currently holding him down did not work for Winston Commercial Real Estate anymore. They worked directly for me. And my very first official directive as the new absolute owner of the building was to have a trespassing, hostile vagrant physically removed from my private property. I gave the 2 large guards a single brief nod. They tightened their firm grip and began dragging the screaming bankrupt developer backward across the polished marble floor. The angry contractors parted like a sea, watching the man who had arrogantly lied to them get humiliated and thrown out into the cold morning air. I stood quietly in the center of my new building and listened to the heavy glass doors slam shut behind him, permanently locking him out of the life he stole. The news of the corporate foreclosure hit the local financial sector by Tuesday afternoon. Once my holding company officially seized the flagship property, the cross-default clauses buried in the commercial loans of Bradley Winston activated like a string of explosives. Every single banking institution he owed money to immediately froze his accounts and demanded full immediate repayment. He had absolutely no remaining leverage to negotiate and no hidden assets to liquidate. By Thursday morning, his expensive corporate lawyers had officially filed for total bankruptcy on his behalf. It was not a strategic financial restructuring designed to save his struggling business. It was a complete and absolute liquidation of his entire corporate identity. The man who had spent a full decade building an empire of arrogance and looking down on my honest labor was rapidly reduced to a stack of worthless public court records. The catastrophic corporate collapse instantly infected his personal life. Because he had recklessly tied his personal assets to his commercial debt, to secure more cash, the aggressive creditors immediately came for his expensive toys. It happened on a bright Saturday morning. 2 heavy-duty commercial tow trucks backed into the long paved driveway of their sprawling glass mansion. The wealthy neighbors stepped out onto their manicured lawns to openly watch the incredible, humiliating spectacle. The drivers attached heavy steel chains to the imported European sports cars Bradley loved to park out front for everyone to admire. Those cars were never actually his property. They were strictly leased on predatory terms he could no longer afford to maintain. The heavy tow trucks dragged the shiny vehicles away, leaving ugly black tire marks on the pristine concrete driveway. The grand illusion of his immense wealth was physically dragged down the street for the entire exclusive neighborhood to witness. Patricia experienced the crushing weight of her new reality the very next day. She blindly attempted to use her premium credit card at an upscale boutique grocery store. The digital machine instantly declined the transaction. She frantically tried a second credit card and then a third. Every single account was completely frozen by the federal bankruptcy proceedings. Her massive line of revolving credit was permanently severed without any warning. The heavy gold necklaces, the designer handbags, and the luxury vacations were suddenly permanent things of the past. She walked out of the store empty-handed, feeling the cold stare of the cashier on her back. The lavish, aristocratic lifestyle she had traded her family to secure had completely evaporated into thin air. She was a woman who had staked her entire existence on the perceived financial value of a man who turned out to be completely worthless. By the end of the month, the massive glass mansion was placed into formal foreclosure by the primary residential mortgage lender. They were given exactly 2 weeks to completely vacate the sprawling premises. They had no cash reserves left to secure a new luxury apartment. They had no wealthy friends willing to lend them money because Bradley had alienated every single contact in his desperate scramble for survival. They were forced to pack their expensive designer clothes into cheap plastic bags and move into a small rundown rental unit on the industrial outskirts of the city. To make matters infinitely worse, the district attorney had officially opened a severe criminal fraud investigation regarding the forged marital contract we submitted. They were absolutely destitute, entirely, publicly humiliated, and living in constant daily terror of impending federal prison sentences. The complete demolition of their toxic reality was absolutely flawless. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when the ghost of my past arrived at my front porch. I was sitting in my living room reading a book on modern architecture when a frantic knocking rattled my solid oak door. The heavy rain from the weekend had returned, washing the neighborhood in a cold, gray downpour. I marked my page, set the book down, and walked to the entryway. I turned on the porch light and looked through the glass pane. Standing out in the freezing rain, completely soaked and shivering, was my daughter. She was dragging 2 large plastic garbage bags filled with her clothes. The expensive designer luggage she used to parade around with was completely gone, undoubtedly seized by the bankruptcy courts along with everything else. I slowly opened the heavy wooden door and stood in the frame. Sarah immediately collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing uncontrollably. The meticulously crafted facade of the arrogant university student was completely destroyed. She looked exactly like a frightened child who had strayed too far from home and lost her way in the dark. She begged me to let her inside, claiming she was freezing and had absolutely nowhere else to go. She stated that her mother and Bradley were living in a cramped motel room on the edge of town and had kicked her out to save money on food. She stood on my modest porch, the very same porch she had openly mocked for being too small and common, and frantically pleaded for my sanctuary. She cried out that she was incredibly sorry for everything that happened in the law firm. She launched into a highly rehearsed speech, shifting all the blame entirely onto Patricia. She swore through her heavy tears that she had been completely brainwashed by their toxic greed. She claimed her mother had forced her to sign the civil lawsuit documents under severe emotional duress. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and played her final desperate card. She reached out and grabbed my arm with her freezing fingers, promising that she would go to the county courthouse tomorrow morning. She swore she would officially drop the wealthy last name she had chosen and legally become a Caldwell again. She offered to return my identity to me as if it were a cheap piece of jewelry she had simply borrowed. She genuinely believed that this single empty gesture would instantly erase the massive criminal fraud she had actively participated in. She thought offering me the absolute bare minimum of respect would magically unlock my door. I stood in the doorway and looked down at the young woman I had raised from infancy. 10 years ago, seeing her cry in the cold rain would have completely broken my heart. I would have instantly pulled her inside, wrapped her in a warm blanket, and promised to fix every single one of her problems. But the soft and accommodating man who used to do those things was entirely gone. I looked at her crying face and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound clarity. I did not feel a single drop of parental guilt. I saw completely through the desperate theatrical performance. She was not crying because she missed her father, or because she felt genuine remorse for trying to destroy my life. She was simply crying because she was wet, cold, and completely out of free money. I stood in the open doorway with the cold wind blowing rain across my porch. I looked at the young woman crying in front of me, and I realized that the profound emotional bond I once felt for my daughter had been completely severed. It was not severed by the legal paperwork she filed or the forged contract she tried to use against me in court. It was severed by her absolute lack of genuine respect. Sarah looked up at me with tears streaming down her freezing face, waiting for me to step aside and invite her into the warmth of my home. She was waiting for the unconditional forgiveness she had taken for granted her entire life. She fully expected the soft and dependable retired engineer to immediately surrender to his paternal instincts and shield her from the harsh consequences of her own actions. I did not move a single inch. I kept my hands resting casually in the pockets of my trousers, and I looked directly into her eyes. I spoke in a quiet and perfectly measured voice that carried no anger and absolutely no pity. I told her that I did not believe a single word she just said. I told her she was not a helpless victim of manipulation. She was a highly educated adult who made a calculated financial decision. When Bradley Winston appeared to possess endless wealth and glamorous social status, she eagerly threw away her heritage to become part of his elite world. She willingly participated in the civil extortion lawsuit because she genuinely believed she was going to get a massive payout from my carefully managed life savings. She only regretted her actions now because the corporate bank accounts were completely empty and the expensive leased cars were dragged away down the street. I watched her mouth drop open in shock. She tried to interrupt me and profess her profound love, but I raised my hand and demanded absolute silence. I told her that she fundamentally misunderstood the entire concept of family. I explained that loyalty is not a heavy winter coat that you simply take off and throw in the closet the moment the sun comes out and the weather gets warm. You do not get to abandon the people who built your solid foundation just because a flashy stranger offers you a ride in a shiny new luxury vehicle. And you absolutely do not get to put that coat back on when the cold winter suddenly returns and you find yourself freezing in the rain. I told her that changing her last name back to Caldwell would accomplish absolutely nothing. A legal name is just a collection of letters printed on a government document. The name Caldwell used to represent a shared history of sacrifice, mutual respect, and unconditional trust. She had personally taken a heavy sledgehammer to that trust and ground it into fine dust. I informed her that I felt absolutely zero guilt about keeping my door firmly shut. The young woman standing on my porch was a complete stranger to me. She was simply a person named Sarah Winston, who had aggressively gambled her entire future on a fraudulent empire and spectacularly lost. I told her she needed to stop crying and start figuring out how to survive in the real world because the protective shelter she was begging for no longer existed. I watched my daughter desperately try to formulate another fabricated excuse. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no words came out. She finally understood that the emotional leverage she had relied on for her entire existence was completely gone. I did not raise my voice and I did not show her any lingering anger. I simply reached inside the back pocket of my trousers and pulled out my small leather checkbook. I also withdrew the silver fountain pen I always carried. I did not invite her inside out of the freezing rain to complete this final transaction. I used the wooden frame of my front entryway as a hard writing surface. I clicked the pen and began to write. The only sound on the front porch was the heavy rain hitting the concrete steps and the sharp scratch of my pen against the paper. I filled out the current date. I wrote her legal name, exactly as she had formally chosen it, in the county courthouse. Sarah Winston. I filled in the numerical amount of exactly $2,000. I signed my name at the bottom, with the exact same deliberate strokes I had used on the massive commercial foreclosure documents. I tore the small slip of paper from the leather binding and held it out into the cold night air. Sarah stared at the piece of paper fluttering slightly in the autumn wind. She looked profoundly confused. She slowly reached out her trembling hand and took the check from my fingers. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and explained exactly what she was holding. I told her that $2,000 was more than enough money to secure the first month of rent and a basic security deposit on a small studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood. I told her it was enough to buy a cheap mattress, a warm blanket, and a week worth of groceries from a discount supermarket. I then made my final boundary absolutely clear. I informed her that this was the very last piece of financial assistance she would ever receive from me. I told her she was a 21-year-old adult entirely capable of finding a minimum wage job to support herself. I explained that she was now solely responsible for her own survival, her own shelter, and her own future. She had eagerly wanted to play the high-stakes financial games of wealthy adults, and now she was going to experience the brutal reality of what happens when you lose everything. Sarah looked down at the signed check, and then back up at my face. The absolute realization of her total isolation finally settled over her completely. She was no longer a pampered university student floating on the silent sacrifices of an old man. She was a destitute adult standing in the freezing rain, holding the absolute final scrap of my generosity. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to beg one last time, or perhaps to finally apologize with genuine sincerity. But I had already heard enough lies to last the rest of my natural life. I did not wait for her final words. I told her to take the money and walk away. I took one step back into the warm, quiet sanctuary of my home. I looked at her shivering on the wet concrete porch for the very last time. Then I grasped the heavy brass handle of my solid oak door and pushed it forward. The door swung shut with a firm, heavy thud, permanently severing our ties. I reached up and turned the deadbolt, locking the metal cylinder firmly into place. The morning sun crested over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across my quiet neighborhood. I stepped out onto my front porch, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The heavy storm from earlier in the week had completely washed the sky, leaving behind a brilliant and unbroken blue canvas. I sat down in my favorite wooden rocking chair and took a slow, deep breath of the crisp morning air. For the first time in over 10 years, my mind was entirely quiet. The relentless, toxic noise was permanently gone. There were no more passive-aggressive text messages demanding money. There were no more flashy sports cars parked in driveways designed to make me feel small. The heavy, suffocating, dark cloud of manipulation and greed had been completely blown away. I was finally completely alone, and it was the most beautiful feeling in the entire world. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden table next to my chair. Resting on the tabletop was a large, thick roll of heavy paper. I reached over and unrolled the wide, crisp sheets, smoothing the corners down with my calloused hands. They were the preliminary structural blueprints for a new local community center. The city council had called me 2 days ago, asking if a retired civil engineer might be willing to consult on the foundational design. I looked at the intricate grid lines, the load-bearing calculations, and the honest mathematics printed in dark blue ink. This was the exact kind of work I truly loved. It was the absolute opposite of the fraudulent paper empire I had just systematically demolished. A community center was a real physical structure designed to shelter people and bring them together. It was built on solid bedrock and unbreakable physical laws, not forged signatures and predatory credit cards. I traced my finger along the main support beams drawn on the paper and felt a profound sense of restored dignity settle deep inside my chest. I had spent a decade quietly absorbing the insults and the disrespect of a family that only valued me for my bank account. I had allowed them to treat me like a disposable asset. But I had finally drawn an absolute and impenetrable boundary. I did not wonder where Patricia and Bradley were currently living. I did not spend my morning worrying if Sarah had found a cheap apartment or a minimum wage job. Those people were completely erased from my daily reality. They were simply ghosts who had tried to haunt a house made of solid brick. The massive legal trap I engineered had functioned flawlessly, and the subsequent silence was my ultimate reward. I had successfully protected my life savings, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my own self-respect. I leaned back in my rocking chair and picked up my coffee mug. The warm ceramic felt grounding and real in my hands. I took a slow, deliberate sip and listened to the quiet morning sounds of my neighborhood. A gentle breeze rustled the green leaves of the large oak tree in my front yard. I looked at my modest home, my reliable truck parked in the driveway, and the honest blueprints resting on my table. I was a man who spent his entire life making sure things were built correctly, so they would never fall apart under pressure. I had finally applied that exact same rigorous standard to my own personal life. The weak, rotting timber was entirely removed. The foundation was inspected and completely secure. I closed my eyes and smiled into the warm sunlight, ready to simply enjoy the rest of my quiet, beautiful life. The most profound lesson we can learn from this story is that true wealth and lasting stability are never built on flashy illusions or the exploitation of other people. A life constructed on deception and greed is exactly like a tall building with a rotting foundation. It might look impressive from the outside for a short period of time, but it will always collapse under its own heavy weight. Real strength comes from quiet integrity, honest labor, and the absolute courage to set firm boundaries against toxic people, even if they share your own blood. Genuine respect and loyalty must be continuously earned through honest actions, and they can never be demanded out of pure financial convenience. Please share this story with someone who might need a powerful reminder to protect their own peace and build their life on a solid, honest foundation.